Close your eyes for just a moment. Picture an Australia that almost feels like another world. An Australia where a single income could buy a family home. An Australia where neighbors knew each other's names. Australia where children played outside until the streetlights came on. For millions of Australians, this isn't imagination's memory. Many Australians remember shopping centers filled with products proudly stamped "Made in Australia." Australian shelves were filled with goods built by Australian hands. Australians remember hearing the whistle of nearby factories every morning. Australian trucks carried Australian-made products across the nation. Back then, Australia felt steady. Australia wasn't perfect, but it felt predictable. Australian parents believed hard work would always be rewarded. Australians believed their children would live even better lives. That belief became known as the Australian dream. For millions of Australians, it felt achievable. Owning an Australian home wasn't a distant fantasy. It was simply the next step after building a stable career, a secure Australian job, affordable Australian housing, weekends at local sporting clubs, family holidays along the Australian coast, neighbors who looked after each other, Australian communities where everyone knew someone. Together, these moments created quiet confidence. Australians believed the country's best years were still ahead. No one imagined how quickly things could change. No one expected an entire way of life to slowly disappear. Almost without anyone noticing, Australian shop fronts became emptier. Australian factories grew quieter every year. Country towns across Australia began losing businesses. Australian families watched secure careers slowly disappear. Certainty slowly became uncertainty. Hope slowly became concern. The Australia many people believed would last forever began changing one decision at a time. Today, many older Australians quietly say, "It just doesn't feel like the same country anymore." But is that simply nostalgia? Or did Australia truly lose something important? To answer that question, we must return to the Australia that built itself. An Australia powered by hardworking people. An Australia that believed it could build its own future. Australia didn't become one of the world's most prosperous nations by chance. Australia was built by generations who believed in hard work and self-reliance. After the Second World War, Australia entered a period of remarkable growth. Australian factories expanded as new industries created thousands of secure jobs. Across Australia, the sound of machinery became the sound of opportunity. Australian workers built cars, forged steel, refined fuel, and made everyday products. Factories across Australia employed entire generations of Australians. A single workplace could support hundreds of Australian families. Young Australians often left school on Friday. By Monday, they had started apprenticeships that could last a lifetime. Australian parents knew that stable work meant stable lives. Australian wages helped families buy homes, raise children, and save for retirement. Products proudly labeled "Made in Australia" filled Australian homes. Australians trusted goods built by Australian workers. Holden became more than a car company. For many Australians, it became a symbol of national pride. Australian steel built bridges, railways, schools, and hospitals. Australia's heavy industry helped shape the nation from coast to coast. Australian refineries processed fuel that powered the economy. Australian textile mills produced clothing worn by millions of Australians. Country towns across Australia depended on local industries. One Australian factory often supported dozens of nearby businesses. Local cafes opened before sunrise for Australian shift workers. Sporting clubs, shops, and schools thrived because Australian jobs kept communities alive. There was a deep confidence across Australia. Australians believed these industries would always remain part of the country's future. Few Australians imagined those familiar factory gates could ever close. Few believed Australia would one day import so many products it once proudly made itself. The warning signs were already beginning to appear. But most Australians were too busy building their lives to notice them. Within just a few decades, Australia would face decisions that changed its economy forever. And many Australians are still debating whether those changes made the nation stronger or left something. The change didn't happen overnight. Australia changed one decision at a time. During the 1980s and 1990s, Australia opened its economy to the world. Australian governments reduced tariffs and encouraged greater global competition. The goal was simple. Australia would become more efficient, more competitive, and more connected to international markets. For many Australians, these reforms brought lower prices and more choices. Imported products became cheaper than many goods made in Australia. This Businesses across Australia faced a difficult reality. Australian factories now competed with countries where labor costs were far lower. One by one, Australian manufacturers began struggling to survive. Profit margins became smaller, while competition became stronger every year. Some Australian companies modernized and adapted. Others simply couldn't keep up with the pace of global change. Factory closures slowly became familiar headlines across Australia. Communities that had relied on manufacturing suddenly faced uncertainty. For thousands of Australians, losing a factory wasn't just losing a job. It meant losing friendships, routines, identity, and financial security. Young Australians entering the workforce found fewer apprenticeships. Australian careers that once lasted decades became much harder to find. Entire industries gradually disappeared from Australia. Cars, clothing, electronics, and many manufactured goods were increasingly imported instead. Australia continued exporting enormous amounts of iron ore, coal, and natural gas. But many Australians noticed that more finished products were now arriving from overseas. Supporters argued these changes made Australia wealthier and more competitive. Critics believed Australia had become too dependent on imports and foreign supply chains. Both arguments contain some truth. Australia gained access to a global marketplace, but it also lost parts of its industrial base. Looking back, many Australians ask the same question. Could Australia have remained globally competitive while protecting more of its manufacturing? That question still shapes national debate today. Because the consequences reach far beyond factories, they reach into the lives of everyday Australians. Today, Australia is wealthier on paper than ever before, yet many Australians feel less financially secure than previous generations. Australia's economy continues to grow in many areas, but many Australian families say everyday life has become harder to afford. For young Australians, buying a home often feels further away than ever. Australia's housing prices have risen much faster than many wages. Australian workers are earning incomes that once seemed comfortable, yet many Australians still struggle with mortgages, rent, and rising living costs. Across Australia, everyday essentials cost more than they once did. Food, electricity, insurance, and transport place growing pressure on Australian households. Many Australian country towns continue searching for new opportunities. The factories that once supported local Australia have long since disappeared. Some Australian communities have successfully reinvented themselves. Others continue losing businesses, jobs, and younger generations every year. Many Australians now work in healthcare, education, technology, mining, or professional services. Australia has created new industries, but they are not always located where old industries disappeared. For older Australians, the biggest change is often not economic. It is the feeling that Australia no longer looks or feels quite the same. Many Australians remember knowing the people who built their furniture, repaired their cars, or worked at the local factory. Today, much of what Australia buys arrives from thousands of kilometers away. Global trade has brought Australians greater choice and lower prices in many products. But Australia has also become more dependent on overseas manufacturing and supply chains. Recent global disruptions reminded Australians of that dependence. When international supply chains slowed, Australia felt the impact almost immediately. The debate is no longer only about economics. For many Australians, it is also about resilience, independence, and national confidence. The biggest question facing Australia today is no longer what was lost. It is whether Australia still has the determination to build something lasting once again. History shows that Australia has never lacked talent. Australia has always been rich in ideas, resources, and determined people. Australian engineers continue developing world-class technology. Australian researchers still make discoveries that influence the world. Australia remains one of the richest nations in natural resources. Australian mines produce minerals essential for modern industries. Australia exports enormous quantities of iron ore, lithium, and natural gas. Yet many Australian factories that once transformed those resources are gone. Some Australians believe the nation should simply follow the global economy. Others believe Australia must rebuild industries that create long-term security. Around the world, many countries are bringing manufacturing back home. Australia is now asking whether it should do the same. Recent global crises exposed how vulnerable supply chains can become. Australia discovered that relying entirely on overseas production carries real risks. Many Australians now support making more essential products at home. Australian manufacturing is once again becoming part of national conversations. Building factories is only one part of the challenge. Australia also needs skilled workers, apprenticeships, and long-term investment. Young Australians need careers that offer stability and purpose. Australia must give the next generation reasons to believe in their future. Australian businesses also need confidence to invest for decades, not just years. Australia cannot rebuild overnight, but every journey begins with one decision. This is not about rejecting global trade. Australia has benefited greatly from being connected to the world. The real question is balance. How much should Australia depend on others for the essentials of everyday life? Perhaps the future is not about returning to the past. Perhaps Australia can build something even stronger than before. Australia of tomorrow will not look exactly like yesterday. Australians still have the knowledge, the resources, and the determination to shape what comes next. The next chapter of Australia's story has not yet been written. Every Australian has a role in deciding how that story unfolds. Australia has faced enormous challenges before. Australians have endured wars, recessions, droughts, and economic transformation. Every generation of Australians inherited a different country. Every generation was asked to decide what Australia should become next. Today, Australia stands at another turning point. The choices Australians make today may shape the nation for decades. This is not simply about factories or manufacturing. It is about the kind of Australia future generations will inherit. Will Australia remain a nation that mostly exports raw materials? Or will Australia once again become a country that proudly builds more of its own future? Will young Australians believe home ownership is still possible? Will Australian families once again feel confident about tomorrow? Will Australian country towns continue to shrink? Or can Australia breathe new life into the communities that once powered the nation? No government alone can answer these questions. No single company can rebuild Australia's future on its own. The future of Australia depends on millions of everyday decisions. Australians choose where they work, what they buy, what they support, and what they value. History reminds us that Australia has always adapted. But history also reminds Australians that every decision comes with trade-offs. The Australia our grandparents remembered cannot be recreated exactly. Time moves forward, and every nation must evolve. Yet the values that built Australia remain just as important today. Hard work, innovation, resilience, community, and belief in one another still define many Australians. Perhaps Australia's greatest strength was never its factories alone. Perhaps Australia's greatest strength has always been its people. The story of Australia is not finished. The next chapter is still waiting to be written. One day, today's children will look back on this moment. They will ask what kind of Australia we chose to leave behind. And perhaps the most important question of all is this: did Australia simply change with the times? Or did Australians allow something truly priceless to quietly slip away forever?